For our discussion of today, we're going to use a number of different sources. The first of which comes from a sefer that's called Heviani Chadarav, and it was just published. It's about 500 pages long, very long book. And the first tshuva that I want to discuss with you, which is on page Nun Beis, is gel chitui. And it seems that this kind of gel is not like a normal liquid soap, which we allow on Shabbos because it's not called memachek. And in this case, it's much thicker. There's another issue that we have to address here with regard to this gel, and that is refuah on Shabbos. The Chazal prohibited refuah on Shabbos. So as far as the last issue is concerned, he says that this is not an issue at all, and all the poskim agree that this does not come under refuah. This is not called an act of therapy because it's just nikayon. It's just a matter of cleanliness. It's like alcohol. It's something to cleanse. But as far as the first issue is concerned, if it's a liquid or if it's not a liquid, here he quotes two opinions. And according to one opinion, we should not be using this aquagel in its form as it is because it's too thick. And therefore, that opinion will maintain, and this is also the opinion of one of the Rabbanim here in Har Nof, Rabbi Rubin, that you should add water to it before Shabbos. However, other poskim say that might be a good idea, but as a fallback position, in an event that he did not add water before Shabbos, he can still use it, and he can rely on those who maintain that this aquagel still has the status of a liquid. So that to summarize, we could say that l'chatchila, one should make sure that it's a pourable liquid and add some extra element of liquid of water before Shabbos, but certainly, if that was not done, then as a fallback position, we have plenty of poskim to rely on, that this is called rechitzas yadayim. It is considered nozli, which means it's a liquid, and it's okay. The next question that I want to discuss with you, which is also in this sefer, is to be found on page Kuf Chaf Gimel. And this is a tshuva from Rav Azriel Auerbach, whose brother just passed away recently, Rav Shmuel Auerbach. Anyway, he's the son of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And he's discussing a case which could be quite relevant in Chutzlar. It's a little bit less common here, and that is there's no Eruv. Are you allowed to go out into Rosh Hashanah wearing a mask without an Eruv? And he begins his tshuva by quoting a Siman in Shulchan Aruch, or a Chayiv Siman Shon Aleph in Hilchos Shabbos, and there the Machaber brings two basic principles. The first is that a woman is allowed to wear a pad in order that she shouldn't get dirty from Dam Nida. And would she be allowed to wear this in Rosh Hashanah? It all depends. The Machaber says that if it has a kind of a band around it, sort of like if I can give a mushal from an apron, you know, that you tie it in the back. So if this kind of a pad is tied around, then he says it's a levush, it's a malbush, it's something that you wear. Now in Hilchos Shabbos, we have two different concepts. One concept is masa, that's what you carry, and that's of course a violation of Meleches Hotzah. And then there's something called malbush. The Machaber says that in the case of a woman who doesn't want to get dirty, that in itself is not enough to make it into a malbush, but she has to tie it around her body. The second principle that the Shulchan Aruch codifies in the same Siman in Shulchan Aruch is that if her purpose is to prevent herself from tsa'ar. In other words, somehow the dam that gets collected here is going to relieve her of some sort of ke'ev, kidei shelo titztayer al yedei adam. So that's already a different case. That's not just for the sake of protecting her garments. That which you wear to protect your garment itself is not a malbush, and we often wear different kinds of plastics and so forth to cover our garments, especially during the rainy season. Those are all very problematic in the case of the absence of an eruv, unless you somehow tie it around your body. Tying it around the beged as a protection for the beged so it won't get dirty and so forth, that's not enough. It's got to be a malbush around the body. But if you're wearing something in order to prevent sa'ar, then he allows it. And the Mishnah Berurah tries to explain why it should make a difference if he's wearing it just to protect himself from tsar. And the Mishnah Berurah basically says that when you wear something to protect yourself from tsar, it becomes almost like a permanent part of your body at that particular time in your life when it could cause tsar. And he describes that the dam, if it falls on her basar, it gets dried, and then it's very irritating and disturbing. So in order to protect that and prevent that tsar, she wears this pad, and that's called derech malbush. Therefore, getting back to our question, if you're wearing a mask in order to protect you from this pandemic, that comes under the second category, says Rabbi Auerbach. Clearly, this is being worn in order to protect you from tsar, from a terrible chas v'sholom amount of tsar, if you will, be infected. And therefore, it's no difference. It's not different than the second case, which he wears this pad in order to protect herself from tsar. And that's where it's at. He even goes as far as to say that if your person wants to wear a shield, which once again, it's difficult to imagine that wearing a shield in and of itself is a malbush, at least in the case of a mask. To some extent, it covers the mouth, it covers the nose, you wear it around the ears. But here's a case where he simply covers his face with a shield. He says even that is mutter on Shabbos. It's considered a malbush because he's doing it in order to protect himself and save himself from tsar. And therefore, he says that this is considered derech malbush, and he thinks you can wear a mask even in a place where there's no eruv. Now, before I go on, there's a second part to this tshuva which is important, but I just want to mention that there are various types of jewels and additions to one's clothes that the Gemara says in Shabbos we're afraid they might fall off, and inadvertently a person might carry them 4 amos in Rishus Harab. However, one could perhaps argue, at least in the case of an inexpensive mask where you buy like 100 of them in a package, and once you use them once, you don't necessarily want to use them again and again. If it fell off, I don't think you would bother picking it up and carrying it 4 amos in Rishus Harabim. That's my humble opinion. Let's go to the second half of Rav Azriel Auerbach's tshuva. Yesh Lodin, he says, but I'm nervous about the following. I'll read to you his language. He says, Adam halovesh maseichal panav dak michum gzeres hashilton shelo yikansuhu. Now, again, this is very relevant here in Israel. I don't know exactly on a daily basis. It may change from hour to hour, day to day, but certainly not that long ago, we remember that the police were giving out fines of 500 shekel if anyone is walking around without a mask in a public area. And he's wearing the mask not because he thinks he has to be saved from this disease. He has no kavanah whatsoever to save himself and protect himself. He's only wearing the mask because he doesn't want to pay the bucks. He doesn't want to have to pay a penalty if he gets caught without the mask. He's basically trying to fulfill the requirements of the authorities. Now here I want to add a comment of my own, and that is that all of Hilchos Shabbos is really based on and built upon kavanah, meaning what was your intention? You might ask, what difference does it make? If he's wearing the mask, it's either a malbush and it's mutter, or it's not malbush and you're carrying it and it's also. But no, says Rav Azriel, it depends upon his kavanah. And we have many, many cases of that sort. We have Malach Hashem Tzricha Gufa, and we have discussions about Dover Shem Miskabi. Many of the categories of Hilchot Shabbos will reflect your personal kavanah. So if your kavanah is Latzule, Mitzar, De Gufa, you don't want to get infected, you think that this mask is really going to protect you, then he says it comes under that second halacha with regard to the case of the Shulchan Aruch about a beged, sinar, shekidei shalo tislach lichi kosheres osa v'eis dam midasa, and in the second category, latzui mitzara. But if on the other hand, you're not at all intending to save yourself and spare yourself of tsar, that's another story. And it would seem at this point in the tshuva that Rav Auerbach wants to be machmir in this case if a person doesn't really genuinely believe that this, and is motivated that this mask that he's wearing will protect. Eladakati Yeshlis topic was at the sof imhig darnu kem malbush. He says the following, that perhaps we could suggest the following, that since the yenim, for somebody else who's interested in protecting his body from tsar, it becomes a malbush, then perhaps the mask itself takes on some sort of objective status and is defined and classified as a malbush. At the end of the day, he vacillates back and forth on this issue, and he leaves it sort of as an open-ended issue in the case where, again, he's not interested, he doesn't believe that he's going to get infected, he's only doing it to protect himself from a knas. Would we say that a masecha is considered objectively a malbush, and therefore I'm not interested in asking this particular Yankel Beryl what his motivation is in wearing the masecha? Or do we say, no, it really is a subjective decision, and what motivates you will determine whether or not you're allowed to wear this masecha in Rishus Hara?
Question?
Please.
So, I mean, there's some people, I don't know, they don't feel they need to wear a shirt or pants for that sake. They were only wearing it because, the Olam wears these
Correct.
things.
So that's a malbush for everybody. He becomes the exception to the rule. Here, Rav Auerbach thinks that Adarabah, you have to make this into a malbush. You're wearing a pad in the case of Dam Nida. That's not a malbush. You're adding a masecha. It doesn't add any beauty. It doesn't protect your body. Or maybe it does protect your body. So that as opposed to clothing, which are worn specifically to protect your body, and therefore it wraps around your body and the limbs of your body, that's called a malbush. Comes along someone, he says, well, I don't need it as a malbush, then Butler Daitait's a kolon, we don't care about his intention. But in the case of a mask, that's not a malbush. Under normal conditions, who would wear a mask? The answer is that under abnormal conditions, it could be that everybody would wear a mask, except for this guy who thinks he's a big shot. He doesn't need to wear a mask. He's a recovery case, and he thinks he has immunity, and therefore he doesn't want to wear a mask. He just doesn't want to pay the 500 shekel knas. So there, I don't know, it's hard to say that it becomes a malbush simply because other people wear the mask. The mask itself is certainly in and of itself not a malbush. It's only a malbush because it's meant to protect you from infection. And that makes it into a malbush. It's a very unique category of a malbush. There are various categories of malbush. One is to protect the body like begadim. The other is a tachshit, which beautifies the person. We also have a category called mitzvah, that if you're wearing something and it's a mitzvah to wear it, that makes it into a malbush like tzitzis, or perhaps tefillin if you hold Shabbos man tefillin. There are many, many different categories of a malbush that are mafkia the meleches hotzo. One of them is hidei shelo titzkair latzule mitzara. And the question is, would a mask fit into that category if he's only wearing the mask, not to save himself from infection and from disease, but rather because he wants to protect himself from the authorities? And that becomes an open-ended question. Honestly, I'm usually makil, but in this case, I think you have to think it out very, very carefully. How to make the mask into a malbush. Maybe if you can beautify it in some way and it fits in with the rest of your clothing, I don't know, maybe you could put it, studded with jewels. I don't know exactly. But unless you really believe it's going to protect you and save you, I don't know if I could be makil so easily in a Rosh Hashana. Okay. Now I'd like you to turn to page Shin Yud Tes, and this is called Bikur Cholim Linidbak Binagif. And this is authored by one of the great Rabbanim of the Chanichei HaYeshivas, which is a tremendous institution in Bnei Brak in Eretz Yisrael, Rav Mordechai Gross. And he wants to know if the mitzvah Bikur Cholim applies vis-a-vis a corona case. And I was fascinated by the question. The answer, honestly, if you can help me out over here, I read it 5 times. I don't understand what his answer is. Maybe the reason I don't understand his answer is because he quotes a myriad of tshuvas, and he doesn't tell you what exactly they say. He tells you look in the Shulchan Gavoa, tells you look in Shut Nishmas Kol Chai, and then he tells you look at Shevet Al-Levi, Shut Ateres Paz, Shut Divrei Yatziv, Shut Ashrei Maskil, Hilchas Bikur Cholim. I mean, he's got a wealth of source material here, but what's the bottom line here? I'm very curious to know. So I'll tell you what I was able to extrapolate from this tshuva, that, often when you read a question that's asked in a responsa, you have your own intuitive answer. You try to guess, whether you do this consciously or subconsciously, what the answer is going to be. And I thought for sure, hands down, this would not come under the mitzvah Bikur Cholim. I don't put my life into danger for the sake of Bikur Cholim. It's not one of the big 3. And I was absolutely shocked when he says, Hine mi ikra de dina, meaning according to the fundamental din, Ika, there is a mitzvah Bikur Cholim, Afshi Yocheli Domek, even though he might contract the disease. So as you can imagine, this knocked the socks off of me. It sounds like it's antithetical to everything I've been taught since I'm a child. But I want to emphasize the words Me'ikar Didina. I'll tell you what I think he has in mind. Again, I'm saying a Pirush Rashi of my own on Rav Mordechai Gross. I think what he means is that in theory, even if it involves a certain element of risk, the mitzvah Bikur Cholim still would apply. Let me explain what I mean. Normally, if I'm doing a mitzvah ben adam lachavero, a chesed on your behalf, I don't have to take risks. That's called chayecha kodmin l'chai chavercha. I don't have to jump in and take a risk for the sake of your benefit, in order to cheer you up because you're lying in bed. Risks I don't have to take. But the exception to that rule is Bikur Cholim. How do I know this? Because the Gemara says in Masechta Nedarim, in the sugya of Chesed and Bikur Cholim, that the best Bikur Cholim is called Ben Gilo. But before we try to answer what Ben Gilo is, the Gemara goes on to say that if it's Ben Gilo, is notel mimenu echad mishishim shebacholya. So in theory, if you can get 60 people to visit you if you're sick, and each one is a Ben Gilo, you will be absolutely, well, it depends how the 1/60 works. Maybe you have to, but anyway, without getting into Zeno's paradox, in theory, that would work. What's Ben Gilo? So some Mefarshim say Ben Gilo means that they were born under the same star. and that means much more than that they have the same birthday. It might mean that they were born at the same hour on the same day. And therefore, they have some sort of connection up in the mazolos that allows one to take away the choli, at least part of it, from the other. Another pshat in Ben Gilo is a more general friendship kind of relationship. And the Chazal say, you take away some of his illness. So the Mefarshim take this very literally. And they assume that it means that the chola now is only 59 over 60 ill, and you, as the mavakir, you have taken on 1 over 60. So all the Mefarshim ask the question, why do you have to risk taking over even 1/60th of the machla for the sake of the mitzvah bikur cholam, chayecha kodmin? And they all answer in one of two ways, and many of the Mefarshim take both directions as two correct answers. One is that 1/60th of the chola is not going to endanger your life. Again, you might not feel well. You can be sniffling for a couple of days and so forth and so on. But it's only 1/60th of the chola of the machla. The other approach is that bikur cholim, which the Gemara derives from a special pasuk, has its own unique dinim, and it suspends the normal principle of chayecha kodmin l'chay chavercha, that ain't finami. You do have to take a certain element of risk, which normally you would not have to do for another mitzvah. But here, in the case of bikur cholim, that's the whole nature of bikur cholim. That bikur cholim, nobody's going to guarantee that when you go in to see a chola, you're not going to contract the disease. Who can write and sign such an arvus for such a thing? And that's the unique nature of bikur cholim, and therefore meikar the dina, says Rav Gross. If we go back to fundamentals, then the mitzvah bikur cholim applies to a coronavirus case, like it does to any other cholim. But that's only meikar the dina, because at this point he backtracks a little, and he says that this sock that I'm giving you only applies at a certain period of time in Eretz Yisrael during this epidemic. Kasher hasakana rechokahi. Now, Rav Gross wrote this approximately, I'm not exactly sure when, but I would say in the month of June, more likely in the month of, the end of the month of June. And the end of the month of June, we were doing here in Eretz Yisrael very, very well. Unfortunately, that's history. We now have a second wave, and many have said that the second wave is much more severe than the first wave. We've already lost over 800 people. It's coming close to 900. I didn't see today's number. And in addition to that, yesterday, more people tested positive than since, I don't remember what month. We're talking about an average of 2,000 people testing positive in a small state on a daily basis. But in that period of time when Rav Gross was addressing this issue, it wasn't a sakana mitsuya or shchicha to contract this disease, but rather it was a sakana rechoka. Now, he might argue that even in the thick of the wave, the heat of the wave, the second wave that we're into now, unfortunately, it's a sakana rechoka, if you take the proper precautions. Now, nobody knows exactly what the proper precautions are. You can wear a suit as if you're Armstrong, landing on the moon. On top of that, you have a mask, and on top of that, you have a shield, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody can guarantee. We're still hearing about people, in the medical fields that are contracting this disease. I don't know if anyone can guarantee anybody of anything when it comes to this disease. And he says that it's a sakana rechoka. So you mevaker chola and you come to the conclusion that it's a sakana rechoka. He doesn't tell you exactly what a sakana rechoka is. I would think it means it's it's something similar to 1 out of 60. And then you chayiv in the mitzvah, bikur chola. The after the alma, you'll ask me a question, wait a minute, in general, in all other halachic considerations, havimuot v'achuzov, even in a case where the statistical probability of or risk of contracting a disease is low statistical probabilities. Nevertheless, daya apikuach nefesh. It's enough to constitute pikuach nefesh. Even if a low statistical probability, it's still called pikuach nefesh. And that's the part of the tshuva that I did understand. Here and on, I can just tell you I'm speculating. And I think what he has in mind in the rest of the tshuva are two major points. Point number one is that it could be that Bikur Cholim is such a significant mitzvah. It's mamish like Hatzolos Nefashos, and here the halacha changes. When you see someone who's in a definite risk, your risk, if you jump in to save him, will be minimal, and we have to talk about what that means by minimal. Then, although it might be pikuach nefesh for you to jump in, you're required to do so for the sake of Vadai, because his life is at stake. And if we upgrade Bikur Cholim to that level, I don't know if you are familiar with this, but there were times I read one testimony of a nurse in Maimonides Hospital during the first wave when it reached its pinnacle. And I remember my father-in-law, there was no way of visiting people. They weren't allowing anyone in. There's a famous story now that's making the rounds about a Hasidic Yid whose elderly mother contracted the disease. And he was an EMT, but according to strict rules, they weren't allowing him to go in. He was afraid his mother was now on a ventilator. She would get off the ventilator. She'd be so disoriented. She has to see someone that she knows, a member of the family. He immediately contacted, if you heard the story, an old age home that was very close to this hospital where his mother was being hospitalized on a ventilator. And he was able to hire a nurse. And the nurse is allowed to go in because she's a registered nurse. He asked if he could accompany her because he's an EMT. And when she goes in, he would go in. And the head of the hospital says, I would lose my license. No way I could do it. So what does he do? During the Corona period, they were lowering the standards of which nurses would be allowed to enter into the hospital because of the need for nursing in Corona. And there are various levels in the city of New York of nurses. And there's something called a practical nurse, apparently. This man, this Hasidic Yid, who's an EMT, locked himself up in a room for 3 days, Yom V'Layla, and he was able to take the test, and he qualified as a nurse. All this for the sake of Kibbud Aim, so that he could go in and be there when his mother would wake up off the ventilator. Mind-boggling story. And in the case of Bikur Cholim, of a Corona case, knowing the difficulties, it could come under Pikuach Nefesh. And then the laws change because it's no longer, do I have to expose myself to a 1/6 or 1/60 risk for the sake of Bikur Cholim? Now it becomes a very different case, a horse of a different color. Furthermore, what exactly is a risk? When is it considered something that could qualify as Pikuach Nefesh, and if you don't put your life at risk for the sake of someone else? So some of the poskim say it's 1/6. In other words, 1/6 is enough of a statistic. I don't know how much that is, and if somebody could work that out for me, I think it's about 16%. If that percentage of risk statistically exists, then you're not allowed to put your life into danger. But if it's less than that, let's say it's 1/7, then you put your life into danger. A lot of this has to do, my friends, with childbirth back in the day. Today, childbirth, although it still has an element of risk, and we have the epidurals and a whole bunch of different things that are perhaps have elements of life-threatening for a childbearing mother. But back in the day, death at childbirth was much more common, and yet the Torah commands the mitzvah period of Arivia, and Rameir Simcha and others say that the percentage is less than 1/6, and therefore it's not considered Pikuach Nefesh. And for the sake of the mitzvah, we do expose ourselves to that low statistical risk. So Rav Gross might be talking about a situation, as we said before, between the first wave and the second wave, and the element of risk to visit a corona patient is less than 1/6. Perhaps that's what he has in mind. And if I don't have to go through the whole chishuv of saying, well, you're visiting the sick in this case, it's mamish pikuach nefesh. Leave out the pikuach nefesh element, but on a statistical probability level, it's less than pikuach nefesh if you expose yourself to that possibility. Again, you take all the precautions that you possibly can, and you're mavakir. So again, if any of you would have time, it's just one little page, half of which we went through. It's not one of these long tshuvas. And tell me if you got anything more out of this tshuva than what I got out of the tshuva. At the end of the tshuva, it's mind-boggling. The man writes that when you enter in to see the chole, take with you some sefer and learn some Torah with the chole. And he writes, based on a Gemara in Ksubas, there was a machla called Rosh Hashana, which was a very contagious machla. And the Gemara says that if you go in to visit one of these Balei Rosh Hashana, it's almost like visiting a leper, and you're osek b'Torah, then the pasuk that says Kol machla shesamti mitzrayim lo'asim olecha ki ani Hashem rofecha applies, and you will be spared from any danger. And it would seem from the poskim, he quotes the Sam Sofer, that that's an absolute guarantee for anyone. Mashma de kol echad muftach b'limud Torah. But lo rak Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the story there in the Gemara in Ksubas was Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, and you don't need a gadol b'Torah, shleimus b'Torah. Anyone who goes in to learn some Torah with the chole, is that's enough to protect him from this disease. Omnam, he writes, Kevon shegidro shalo yiskarva lechola b'nogiv zeh el b'merchak v'gam b'zeh matzil is yesh lino kain u'makayim b'zeh mitzvah speaker chol. It says, even though he'll stay at a certain distance based on the authorities, and that'll reduce the sakon element for him to visit the sick, and he's going to add the element of Talmud Torah, and therefore he's makayim the mitzvah of bikur chol. What would Rav Gross say now that we're back to square one and maybe even worse? I don't know. Very unclear. But I just was fascinated by the question. Now, again, I have a lot on the agenda today, but I would like to share with you one tshuva that was written by Rabbi Chanan Peretz, who is the Rav of Ramat Beit Shemesh, where I have a lot of my people are there, about Tfilas Kalim in a case where they closed the mikvos because the Ministry of Health was not allowing access to the mikvos. And this became very relevant at Pesach time because, as you know, we need new Kalim for Pesach, and many of our new Kalim need Tfilah, and the mikvos are closed. So first he says that he has a whole discussion whether Tfilas Kalim is Doraisa D'Rabbanan, very fascinating discussion, but then he goes on to say that the first option would be that you transfer ownership over the Kli to a Gud. Now that requires what's called a Kinyan Yad, and it's not something that you can do over the phone or over Zoom. You know, he has to actually be given the Keli by the Jew, and the guy should be made to understand. He should walk around with it, make sure he understands that he's now the proud owner of this Keli. But in the absence of that option, he has a second option, which he investigates here during the course of this tshuva, and that's called hefker. Am I allowed to take my Kli that requires tefillah and be mafkir, declare it as ownerless, and then use it without tefillah? So if I'm not mistaken, there's a gigantic machlokas about this amongst the Achronim, and the one who got mostly involved in this machlokas was Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And he came up with a compromise shita. He said that I'm not going to accept the Mariel Diskin, who says that hefker is not enough to remove the chiyuv tefillah. I'm not going to accept Rav Elyashiv, my mechutin, who says that you're not obligated in tefillah once you're mafkir it, and also on Shabbos you're allowed to be mafkir it. I will take the middle of the road, and I will suggest that B'shas Chak will rely on hefker. And therefore, Rav Elchanan Peretz says that now that we're in this pandemic, and the authorities have closed down the mikvos, and we need these kelim desperately for Chag, therefore, he says, we're going to rely on this tshuva of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, and we have to make it hefker. Rav Shechter, Zechor Shlita, has written a tshuva, and in the tshuva he writes that we paskin, like one man the Omer in the Dorim, that hefker requires the presence of three. You can only make something hefker in the presence of three. But he says we can fall back on the position that those three individuals do not have to be there physically when you make it hefker, which means that if these three people are gathered together in one place, you own the kli and you're in another location, and you could call them up on the phone, and they'll put you on speakerphone such that all three will hear your declaration simultaneously when you declare, I am making this kli hefker. But there's only one important condition or proviso. These three people have to be able to have access to the kli in order for the hefker to be meaningful. It's not enough just to declare something as hefker and then lock it up in your room and not letting anyone else get access to it. So therefore he says that if you want to be relying on this tshuva of Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the first thing you have to do is take your keli and put it outside. Put it in front of your house. Next, call up a neighbor that has at least two bar mitzvah boy sons that are available, and declare that it's hefker in, so to speak, in inverted commas, in the presence of these three people, all of whom are listening on the phone, and notify them that you've placed the kli in a certain location, and leave it there for a half hour, and then see if anyone bites the bait. So we actually did this on Erev Pesach, and nobody bit the bait, so we took into the kli, and we made a declaration we're not acquiring ownership on the kli, it remains hefker, and therefore we're not chayav in tefillah, and we use the kli. So that's a very fascinating tshuva here in this sefer called Heviani Chadora. Now, Rabbi, as I told you, I have a number of different sources here that I wanted to share with you. One is a compilation of tshuvas of Rav Willig Shlita, which I sent you and thanks again to David Spiegel for sending it out as an attachment, as an email attachment to the email. First of all, it seems that you can have a very detailed list of medical information about the health of a person. The history is his health history on a patch, which you can sew inside a beged. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that the physicians will have immediate access to this medical history. And the question is, how do we get it from the person over to the physician if it means carrying it through Rosh Hashana? So the poskim speak about various cases like keys, where they allow you to make it almost like a bracelet or a belt, and it holds up your pants. And that becomes, as we said it before, a malbush. It's a little bit difficult to take a patch, sew it onto your beged, and call it a malbush. It's an added patch which doesn't in any way add anything to your malbush, unless we apply the principle of bittul. And that's what Rav Willig suggests. He says if it's necessary to make sure that we can get this medical history over to the physician, especially during this pandemic, then sew it onto a beged, maybe on the inside of a beged perhaps, but on a permanent basis. Once again, as we said before, Melechas Shabbos and Melechas Hotzah in particular depends upon your kavana. Your kavana is that this becomes a permanent part of the beged. In the future, you'll show it off as a zeichel ines, but you that's it. It's part of the beged. And truth be told, you have all sorts of things that are attached to your beged. If you open up your suit jacket, you'll find a host of different patches that are sewn on, and nobody bothers removing them, even if there's no air. And the answer is because they're sewn on in a permanent way to your beged. And that generates halacha bittul, in which it becomes an integral part of your beged. And therefore, when you wear the beged and it's a malbush, then any part of that beged is part of the malbush, including that patch that you add on. I was very happy with this tshuva. I thought it was a brilliant move, that it depends upon your kavanah, and if your kavanah is that it should be permanently attached to the beged, then it has the status of malbush like the beged itself. And this always brings a smile to my face, because every problem in halacha has a solution. We need a solution. How to get this medical information over to the doctor? Let's sew it onto a patch. Let's write it on a patch and sew it onto a beged. Okay. Now, in the next tshuva, he begins his discussion about slichos. And the best time for slichos is in the middle of the night or early in the morning, very, very early. But it seems that the shoel, and as I mentioned before, this is Rabbi Shlomo Brody. I know him as Miles. I hope he'll be moichel me, from Modi'in, who's a Talmud of mine way back when. He's the one who asks this question, and he writes that it doesn't seem likely that they'll be able to make an outdoor minyan for slichos at such a late hour. And he's describing the neighborhood that he lives in, and it's what you would call in Yiddish kep auf kep. There are apartments all over the place, so they went outside. And this is a general question about outdoor minyanim. Are you allowed to conduct an outdoor minyan when it'll disturb the neighbors? That has a lot of implications in Hilchos Shchenim and in Kiddush Hashem. But he's talking about the impossibility of reciting slichos in its proper time. And they have two options. And he's asking which of the two options is preferable. One option is between Mincha and Ma'ariv. He calls it Bein Hashmashos. And it means that we're going to daven Mincha. And again, we have to send the people home as early as possible. That's the premise. So I'll give you an example. I daven here in an outdoor minyan, and it's as fast as lightning. Again, if you're lucky to daven inside, which I have that option during Vasikin in the morning, so every day I daven Shachris Vasikin there, it's a very slow minyan. Today, which is not even a Thursday, it took us an hour and 10 minutes. Very slow minyan. Fine, great. But the outdoor minyanim are speeding Gonzalez. So they want to daven Ma'ariv at the earliest possible time. So he writes the following: an outdoor minyan, we cannot meet late at night, like around Chatzos. We cannot meet early in the morning because we'll disturb the neighbors. And he wants to recite slichos, bein hashmashos, between Mincha and Ma'ariv. In other words, the people are eager to daven Ma'ariv at the earliest time, but nevertheless, there is a time slot that they used to between Mincha and Ma'ariv, before Shkia. And he's asking, is that a proper time to recite slichos? It's bein hashmashos. We're not even sure that it's nighttime already. And he asks further than that, if it's preferable to recite slichos during bein hashmashos, then should we do slichos before Shkia in order to guarantee that we could recite Ma'ariv immediately after Shkia, and we don't have to wait for Tzitz. And it's interesting to me that Rav Willig, who is famous for being a real stickler on Zmanim, here he takes a step backwards, and he's very lenient. And he says that the answer to both these questions is yes. Number one, we're going to recite Slichos between Mincha and Ma'ariv during Beit HaShmosh. Number two, we're going to daven Ma'ariv immediately after Shkia, and we're not going to wait for Tzeis HaKol Chaver. And he explains the two answers to the two questions based on, the first question he answers based on Rav Avad Yosef, who says that if you have a choice as far as slichos are concerned between Beit HaShmoshos and nighttime but before Chatzos, then you should recite slichos during Beit HaShmoshos. Second question about setting up slichos during Beit HaShmoshos in a way that we can daven Ma'ariv immediately after Shkia. And he says that if that's the minhag, we accept those poskim who say that if you daven mincha before Shkia, it's not going to help you if you're the type of a Jew davens after Shkia. There are such Jews, but if you're makvid to daven before Shkia, immediately after Shkia you can daven Ma'ariv, and now you want to fit in slichos in the middle. That's a great idea because that's preferable to davening slichos after nightfall before Chatzos. Now, it seems that during this pandemic, many people are buying various commodities over the internet. And I think it's fair to say, tell me if you think I'm wrong, that Amazon is like the leader of the pack for various reasons. But the Shoel says that he has a way of cutting out Amazon. So obviously, if Amazon is a lucrative financial operation, they get a certain extra cut and they get a certain percentage of a benefit by selling you the item. But he says, I can cut out Amazon. All I have to do is go online, see what Amazon is advertising and at what price, and I could track down the manufacturer himself. If I buy it directly from the manufacturer, I cut out Amazon, and I save myself a couple of bucks. Now, on the one hand, we have an Isur Honos Dvar. In other words, I'm not allowed to go into your shop. Let's say you sell shoes. And I'm going to try on every pair of shoes till I decide which pair of shoes it is, and I'll take a little picture of it, and I'll go next door and I'll get it for a cheaper price. That's Honos Dvar. If the Amazonians here gave you a picture of what you should buy with a description, they should be paid for that service. And now you're going ahead and cutting them out and going directly to the manufacturer to buying it. So if Willig sideswipes this question, he says it depends on what's called Minhag HaMedina, and that means that the law of the land reigns supreme. Now, as far as I know, if somebody could correct me, please, if I'm wrong, the law cannot possibly restrict and force a person to buy from Amazon. Whatever Amazon, what's the word I wanted to use? Whatever Amazon advertises publicly, that's accessible to the public, and they have no bars on this. They have no holds on this. There may be a halachic problem because of Onas Dvarim, based on the fact that the company puts so much work in, you have to at least give them the decency of buying the product from that person. Again, unless you can get it at half price elsewhere. So assuming the price of Amazon, the final price is reasonable, then you're not allowed to cut them off and rob them of their percentage of interest, of profit, when they did all this work, and that's how you found out about it. And this touches on the halacha of shidduchim and how to pay a shadchim, and in general how to pay anyone and what I have to pay, what are my obligations to someone who gave me an idea, and then I dropped them and I took that idea and I developed it on my own. And the halacha is very strict about those. But the only thing is here we're talking about Amazon. Not only that, we're talking about publicly accessible advertising. I would find this hard to believe that any country in the world would have legal restrictions that would force a person to buy it from Amazon. When Amazon publicly publicized and advertised this object, this item. If somebody could correct me if I'm wrong, I see Phil is here from Australia, so maybe we have David here and Joe from Canada, and a couple other people from Israel here. I don't know if anybody could tell me if I'm wrong about this. I find it very hard to believe that I'm restricted by the advertiser. I have to buy it directly from the advertiser when he advertised in public. So I'm not sure what Rav Willig means by Dina de Malchusa Dina in terms of the possibility that you would have to buy it from Amazon. I don't see that as a viable possibility. I think you can go ahead and buy it from the manufacturer directly if Amazon chose to publicize their ads. But what's very important to understand is that the laws might change in the case of Eretz Yisrael. Because when you're dealing with a Jewish population, then all the laws of shadchanus, all the laws that govern paying a person for the service that he provides kick in. And if this person is asking you, after giving you all the information and doing all the legwork, to buy the product from him at a reasonable rate, then you have to oblige. That is the halachic morality of buying and selling. Next, he has a question about an old age home locally. They have difficulty finding a balkore. And the question was, if they have someone who prepared, let's say the first 3 aliyos, can they read the rest of the Torah from a chumash? And the Shoel himself, who's unidentified here, says that my preference is they don't read the balance of the parsha from a chumash, but they read it from the Sefer Torah without Tamei HaMikra, even though there's no one in the audience who's prepared the Kriya. And that's the best of the worst, of all the options. Now, you're really setting up a head and a body that don't fit, meaning the beginning of your Kriyas Torah is from the Sefer Torah, and it's with Tamei HaMikra. And the second part of the Kriya, on the same parsha, the same Kriya, you're reading from a Chumash, or alternatively, that's what the Shoel is insisting, you read the rest of the parsha out of the Torah, but without Tamei HaMikra. You'll ask me, well, the first half of the Kriyas Torah I read with Tamei HaMikra, the second half without Tamei HaMikra, and therefore how can I integrate these two parts of Kriyas Torah? The answer is that that's the nature of this mitzvah, that even if you have to piece together the various parts of the parsha, and some will be read with Tamei HaMikra, with what we call Trup, and some parts of the parsha will be read without Trup, that's what we're going to do. And Rav Willig accepts the logic of the Shoel, and he says the following. All this is fine if you have someone who's willing to read from the Torah without Tamei. Should there be no one in the audience who's willing to read without Tamei, and we only have half the parsha that was prepared, like we said before, and the Shoel said that he had aliyos 1 to 3 prepared. In that case, Rav Willig says that instead of reading the balance, instead of dropping the balance of the parsha, which would mean reading it from a chumash, we'll take that half of the parsha, whatever percentage it is irrelevant, that was prepared, and we're going to divide it and chop it up into smaller pieces until we get 7 aliyot. And that's going to avoid this possibility, which is very enigmatic, that we would, if we can't find someone to read the end of the parasha, we would split the mitzvah of Kriyas parasha into two parts. So I think we could summarize this tshuva on Kriyas HaTorah with one word, and that's integration. We want to make sure that all the Kriya from beginning to end is integrated. And the fact that some aliyos are with Trup and some without Trup, that doesn't break up the integration. But to read half of the Chumash from the Klaf and the other half from some other published book, and for that matter, to drop that second half of the Kriya entirely, I would rather that you have someone reading the second half of the Parsha without Trup. Again, that's not so easy to do, but we'll have someone feeding him, and hopefully we'll be able to integrate the second half and finish the Kriya together with the first half. Now, the last question that he addresses is really not our business. It's not related to Corona. This is a question that applies the whole year round, and in all of history, has nothing to do with Corona, and it has to do with a woman who wants to have a child. She can be impregnated by a Jewish owner or a non-Jewish donor. And whereas you and I would have probably intuitively said, let's get a non-Jewish donor, because we don't want to mess around with our rayas. And this child, if he was impregnated by the sperm of his father's biological father, he has to now make sure that he doesn't marry any of the close relatives of his father. And if the donor is non-Jewish, then we might have certain pitfalls. And Rav Willig says that as far as the Jewish owner is concerned, it's preferable, and there are ways of guaranteeing that the child born of such a out of the body of a woman will guarantee that that child will find out, will be notified exactly who his relatives are. Now, as I've mentioned on many occasions, there's something called Omek HaPshat. And for me personally, this Gilyon number 276 is fascinating, but on a conceptual level, because to me, it's fascinating because I finished Masechta Shabbos, and people ask me, how'd you enjoy it? And my classic answer, which I repeated a dozen times, is that's wonderful to finish Masechta Shabbos, but there was one part of Masechta Shabbos that I didn't enjoy at all. And that is the medical parts of the Masechta. They're pretty significant. All sorts of medications and medicines and procedures. And you get yourself a white snake and a black snake, and you boil them together, and you create a thing, a concoction, and it's going to solve your problem, your skin problems. I don't know. I couldn't hack it. I really couldn't hack it. I only taught it because I'm teaching a daily Daf Yomi shiur. Now, what fascinates me is that if I was on the verge of becoming chas v'sholom an apikoros, because I can't believe that Chazal had these kinds of medicines, which don't make any sense to me, that I felt a certain element of identification when the Maharal Prague, who's quoted by Reb Kiva Eger, says that already back in the day they accepted a cherev not to utilize any of the refuos that are mentioned in the Talmud. you were not allowed to use them. And if you rely on such medical therapeutic procedures, then you are in violation of a cheret. And the Marshal, who lived about 5 centuries ago, probably a little bit before the Maharal, no, he was probably a contemporary of the Maharal, he writes the reason that they accepted this cheret because of the cheret of Kadmonim, apparently it dates back hundreds and hundreds of years before the Marshal, who's 5 centuries ago, is because if a person is going to rely on the refuos of the Talmud, then it might turn out, and probably will, that he will not be healed, and that's going to be motzi las on the Talmud. That is going to lower our admiration and respect for the Talmud. And I just wanted to show it to you inside. Okay, we're pressed for time, so you'll have to believe me here. Oh, there it is. If you're on page 1 of Omek Upshat in Gillian 276, you'll see a big number 1. And right below big number 1, he says, Lo lismach al refuas ha-Talmud shelo lahotzi laz al chachomim hakadmon. This would be a kind of a laz. This would shed a very negative light on the Chachmei Talmud that we tried all their recommended medications and therapies and it didn't work. Says the Maharal, but there's one refuah that is not included in the cheret. And that is the refuah that the Gemara has for someone who gets a bone, nebuch, caught in his throat. And the Gemara advocates that he take a similar bone, meaning a bone from the same min, the same species, and he places it over his head, and he recites what's called a lachash, an incantation, and he says, Chad, Chad, Nochis, Bella, Bella, Nochis, Chad, Chad. And why is this particular Talmudic medicinal process allowed? Mipnei shu baduk u'menusek. The ein chashat sheyovo lezalzel b'divrei Chazal. Says the Maharal that this particular therapy is checked. We've investigated it, and it's, how do they advertise every ready battery? First time, every time. It always works. And on page 2 of the Omek Upshat, he quotes one tshuva after the other during the course of Jewish history that they relied on this particular method, and it saved people from choking. And I was thinking out loud that this could be very relevant if you have a baby who's choking. Babies will eat anything. They take into their mouth many things that are on the floor that they cannot possibly swallow. And the mother goes berserk over it. Maybe we should learn how to do this therapy, this lacha. And he quotes on page 2 the Rosh Hashana, who in turn quotes the Rambam, who says that kol davar she'eino tivi, any therapeutic process that's not natural, also you're not allowed to use it. Umutar rak b'davar tivi, we're only allowed to use natural medications. The Gemara asks the Rambam that there are many medications that are advocated, that are recommended, lachash, b'mishanitka, etzem begaron, etc. And they don't seem to have any natural medicinal value. You cannot take them into a chemical lab and analyze it on the level of drugs and so forth. Why? Says the Rambam, apparently there are 2 categories of medicines that were permitted. One is dvarim hapolim, which means things that work b'derech hateva. He says, dvarim hapolim b'derech sguli. Unbelievable. There's something called the skula. And skula is like teva. He says the difference is that if it's a pol b'teva, then rationally I understand how it works and I advocate in favor of it. But in the second category, which is poel b'derech sguli, he says, Yikabel as-seichel efsharuso lo sheyigzar chiyuvo. In other words, he's not going to say that, well, when I use this derech school, it's definitely going to work, and he totally relies on it. But he understands very well that this is a davar sguli, it's somehow a skula, it's some metaphysical kind of a therapy. And uve'emes yedias sibas helem koach haskula einenu gadol mi helem yedias hasiba b'kochos shar inyon. He says, who understands nature? Do we understand how nature works? Do we really understand how the powers and the energy forces operate? And so too, we don't understand the koach sguli. But it shouldn't be any worse than a normal medical procedure. Fascinating. And finally, on page 3, he summarizes this entire discussion. Again, I'm leaving out a lot of major parts here. And he says that the Maharal holds from this cherem, we're not allowed to utilize any refuahs from the Talmud, because of Yovel Lagleg, Al Derech Chachamim, milvad, with the exception of the Lachash Lahotzi Etzem, which is a method that is Baduk Umenutz. It's been relied on, and it's been implemented time after time after time, proven itself to be reliable. Now, if we finally came up with one kind of Talmudic medicine that we're allowed to engage in for therapeutic purposes based on inyan sguli and on the fact that it's baduku menusa, no one's going to be motzi laz on the Talmud. On the contrary, people are going to be in such admiration of the Talmud because we applied this lachash and the person survived. What if it's necessary in order to implement that method on that particular Shabbos, we have to violate the Shabbos. We'd have to carry out, another etzem that looks like this etzem through a Rishus Harab. Can we go that far and say even that's mutter? Or for that matter, let's say he's eating a piece of fish and he gets a bone caught in his throat. He can pluck out another bone from the fish. The only problem is he's now violating on Shabbos the Isur of Borer. So he says here that mutter, he says he's permitted to use this refuah skulit, but as far as being machal Shabbos for the sake of bringing this refuah in, he says, in our generation, ein lahatir, we cannot permit it, mikama tamim, for many reasons. But there is one view that says that since this skula is baduk u'menusa, we're allowed to rely on this medicinal process on Shabbos and on Yom Tov. So we have here a case where we're going to rely on the skula. However, we're not going to violate a malacha d'oraisa for the sake of the skula. We can't know for sure it's going to work. And we're not machal Shabbos for a skuli, but he says there's no isur muktzah. Normally a bone is muktzah, but in this case, it's not muktzah. Then he goes on and says that after he survives this swallowing of a bone through this lachash, which we should write down and copy it over so we have it all the time close to our pockets. He says he's got to set up what he calls a zeichel linet, some sort of memory reminder of the miracle that he achieved. Now, Rabbos, I realize we went a little over time. If you have 5 more minutes, if you got this page, these 3 pages from the OU, which is called Guidelines for Rosh Hashana Yom Kippur. So there's a lot to talk about here, some of which we could still maybe fit in next week. But the most fascinating paragraph here that I found, that he doesn't tell you who he's quoting, is that the appropriate precaution during shofar blowing would be to place a surgical mask over the wider end of the shofar. The Hersta Maisa, it's bad enough that we're wearing masks. Now the shofar has to wear a mask, because imagine all the germs that are coming out of the shofar blower's mouth and they're circulating through the air. You better cover the shofar with a mask. He doesn't tell you the size of the mask and who's producing the mask and how to get a mask, what color the mask should be the same color as the shofar, or maybe you want a contrasting color. So I've been a little bit facetious, and I'll tell you why. Because I opened up the Shulchan Aruch. He doesn't quote any sources. And in Orach Chaim Siman Tov Kuf Pei Vav in Hilchos Rosh Hashana, he writes that if something happens to the shofar, and the voice, the sound of the shofar is impacted, so ein litkah b'shofar, you should not blow the shofar. That shofar. That's the Ramah. Now, what happened to the shofar? So he has a number of possibilities, one of which is it fell and got a crack in it. Another possibility is that there was a hole in the shofar and he plugged up some substance into that hole. And all these problems with the shofar contradict what the Mechaber paskins in the very previous seif, when he writes that kol hakolos ksherim b'shofar, all the sounds are kosher in the shofar. As long as you have a kosher shofar, we don't care what sounds you make. So it could be a thick sound, it could be a thin sound, irrelevant. And therefore, if something happens to the shofar and there's a physical change in the shofar, and it might very well impact on the sound of the shofar, then according to the Mechaber, you can use that shofar, even l'chatchila, unless the impact in the shofar was so radical, the whole shofar is falling apart. But according to the Ramah is writing, ein litkah b'shofar nakuv. Nakuv means that because there's a hole, it changes the sound of the shofar. And not only that, if he plugs up the hole, that might make it even worse. And the Mishnah Berurah writes in Sif Katan Chafei, Kishasasmo Garat Fe, because then it's like 2 shofars. He's hearing the sound of the shofar, and now he's hearing the sound of that material that plugs up the hole. So when the air of his blowing hits that point where there's a stima that let's say you go to a dentist, you get a filling, that's called the stima in modern Hebrew, so that if the stima is going to be part of the shofar, in which case you blow it, when you blow, it hits the side of the shofar, your air hits the side of the shofar to make the sound, and that side of the shofar is invalid as a kol shofar, because he heard it from a stima, not from a shofar. And the Torah says, shofar echad amar Rachmana v'lo shnei shofars. I come therefore to the conclusion that if there's a physical obstruction to the sound of the shofar, then at least according to Ramah, in the case of Nikev, you have to agree and admit that this is not a shofar that you want to use on Rosh Hashana. I presume that if you put a mask over the shofar, it's going to impact on the sound of the shofar. However, if you look at the OU, he writes that an appropriate precaution during shofar blowing would be to place a surgical mask over the wider end of the shofar. And then he writes, as this does not appear to alter the sound of the shofar blast. You see, I'm a little confused because in the case of Nekev, let's say you filled up the hole, you're going to tell me, well, it didn't affect the blast of the shofar. And the coal would have been the identical coal from the shofar, even if not for the reshaping of the shofar. How do I know that it doesn't affect the sound of the shofar? That's not always crystal clear. There's going to be a lot of gray area here. So just like the Ramah says that if the nekev would affect the sound of the shofar, then avoid it. Don't blow from the shofar. And if you plugged up the nekev, that makes it even worse because then you're hearing shnei shofars. But be that as it may, the final two principles are: principle number one, all sounds of a shofar are kosher. Principle number two, b'medvar mamurim, that only applies to all natural sounds of shofar. But if you're talking about a reconstructed shofar, a shofar that has a change in it, like the cases of Nistak and Nikev, and we're not saying that he can't produce a kol shofar in the physical sense, nevertheless it's possible. The only thing is, again, I don't know who to contact in the OU to clarify this issue, but I would think that the OU is working with the following premise. When there's a physical change in the shofar, like for example, a sedek or a nekev, that already changes the shofar. And now the sound that you're going to hear is the sound of a different shofar, which is a shofar saduk or menukav, not the sound of a natural shofar. But here, even if I would grant you that it's the gray area, I can't tell you, we could do an experiment here over Zoom if you have a shofar, and we can cover it with a mask and see even if I would guarantee you that the sound of the shofar was impacted by the mask, which in my humble opinion, that's probably going to be the case, that's irrelevant. It still is kosher. Why? Because you did not change the shofar itself. Just added a mask on a temporary basis to cover the shofar. If it's not an integral part of the shofar, then it doesn't come under the psul of shofar echad v'lo shnei shofars. And even if you'll convince me that the sound of the shofar is changed, that matters not, because kol kolos ksherim b'shofar. But if the sound of the shofar would change because of a physical injury to the shofar, that's already a horse of a different. Okay, we're going to stop here. I'll take questions if anybody wants to stay on. I just want to point out that the OU has all these guidelines. I think all told, they have, 16 different principles and guidelines for Shani Yom Kippur. And I'd like to talk about that in Mitzvah Hashem next week, and a little bit more about a shofar that was covered by a mask. And finally, what we didn't get to today, and here I'm talking to David, if David is still around. Yeah, David's still there. If you look in Haviani Chadarav, and I think this was the last thing that I sent you sequentially in the WhatsApp, you'll see page Tuf Kuf Nun Tes. No, I'm sorry. You'll see page, Tuf Now I'm not finding it right in front of me. Just a second. It's a piece from Rav Eichenstein. I'll write it to you in an email, but just check the WhatsApp. It's the last. It's the last thing that I sent you.
Yeah, I see it.
See it?
On WhatsApp.
Great. What's the page number? Just that we make sure.
On the page number, it's
Can you make it out? Sometimes it's hard
Tav
to
Kuf Nun Ches. Ches, not
Tov
Tet.
Kuf Nun Ches. Okay, thank you. Tov Kuf
Yeah.
Nun Ches. Let me just get that open here. Should be Rav Eichenstein. Let's see if I'm right. Tov Kuf Nun Ches.
Yeah.
Second. Huh. Keep getting the wrong page here. Tov
There's
Kuf.
one page before that, but it's upside down. It's hard to tell what it says.
All right, let me see.
And plus, it's blurry. Plus, the first one is blurry also.
Yeah. Okay, so just write me if you don't mind, and I'll send it to you again because these are the two pages I want to make sure we get next week, and I don't always remember. So it's page Tuf Kuf Nun Aleph. That's the one that you can't make out.
Right.
And the end of that presentation of Rav Eichenstein is on page Tuf Kuf Nun Beis.
Okay.
No. 1 second. Tuf Kuf Nun Vav. All right, so it's Tuf Kuf Nun Aleph and Tuf Kuf Nun Vav. Just those two pages that I'd like to, Belinetta, talk to you about next week.
Tell me,
more research, and if you guys can help me about this issue, which I think is very relevant, both today and tomorrow, about visiting someone who has contracted this this disease. And I, as I told you before, the truth from Rav Gross is very choppy. It's almost like maybe one of the Talmidim wrote it up, and they're missing blanks there. But I'm very curious about this issue, and also about the shofar in the case of a mask. Okay, then any comments, criticisms, questions before we?
Yeah, I have one.
I have a comment.
So in Clanton Park, are the guy who blows shofar is already covering it with a mask. It doesn't sound any different than it used to.
And is he going to do so even on Rosh Hashana?
He's not blowing Rosh Hashana as far as I know. I mean, he may be privately for people, but like he doesn't do it in shul.
So look, what you blow during the month of Elul, I mean, that doesn't bother me one way or the other. That's just a minhag. It's just a memory device. But now we're talking about a dorais. I think this year, what day is Rosh Hashana?
Well, it's Shabbos Sunday.
Sunday?
Sunday, only one day, yeah.
Well, no, but I'm saying Rosh Hashana is on Shabbos?
Yeah, first day.
Yeah. So again, it's hard to say whether we're talking about a dorais or not.
Exactly.
That's a sugya in Masechet Eruvin, actually. But there's no doubt about it that Rosh Hashana and Shofar is one and the same. So the halachas of Shofar, and when you make a change in the Shofar that's going to impact on the sound, again, they're claiming, although he's not sure either, the OU, once you play around with the sound of the Shofar, again, if you're absolutely convinced that it doesn't change the sound of the shofar, I have nothing to talk about. But I'm going to try an experiment, and Belinetta, and I think it might have an impact on the college.
Maybe.
Now, somebody else wanted to ask me a question. No, okay. All right, so let's stop here.
Sure.
Can you hear me now, Rabbi Berzon?
Yes, I hear you.
Can you hear me now?
I hear you.
So if a person has a dental problem and for aesthetic reasons wants to wear the mask on Shabbos, doesn't want to be embarrassed, it's purely aesthetic, it doesn't want to be cloistered in the house over Shabbos, and refuses. Is that allowed on Rishus Harabi?
So the mask itself is covering some sort of
A dental
blo-
problem.
right.
Yeah.
And as a result of wearing the mask, the person looks better.
Well, you know, he doesn't want to go parading around with his dental problem.
Right.
He doesn't want anyone to know about it. It covers
Yeah, I
up
would
the
think
teeth.
I would think that in that case, it's definitely a malbush because mimonafshah. If we say it's a malbush because this is the requirement health-wise, and it's irrelevant whether you are motivated for this reason or that reason, then it's objectively a malbush. It's just sorry. And even if I go with the second side, there's a difference between someone who wears something around his body because he's afraid of paying a fine and someone who wears something around the body because it improves their presentation and their appearance. Once it improves their presentation or their appearance, then it's already a malbush. Why? Because as I said at the outset, there are many different categories of malbush, one of which is something that, although it doesn't protect the body, but it beautifies. And that's called a takshit. And if this adds to the beauty of a person, unless you're going to say, wait, I'm just thinking out loud, maybe a takshit has a positive beauty. Here, you're just covering something that's a blemish.
Right.
I don't know. Maybe we'd have to research that further, but I definitely feel that you have what to rely on because even Rav Auerbach, although he has this case of someone who's not motivated for health reasons, but he does seem to assume that it's a malbush objective. But I'm going to have to stop now. I apologize. I'm just wiped out. This is the fourth shiur of my day. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you
And
very
please,
much.
feel free to communicate with me by email or any other method. Thank you. Thank you so much.